Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987 along with Greg Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. We are on here today because of you, viewers and watchers like you. In order to continue the podcast, we need to monetize our YouTube channel so we can get guests on that require financial compensation. That's where viewers like you come in. If you subscribe today, we can get that number up to 1,000. And as an incentive, the 1,000th subscriber will receive a free t-shirt just like this and receive a book from the legendary George Shire on his Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors, signed by George Shire himself. So please get on there, tell your friends to subscribe today. And when you hit that 1,000 mark, you're going to get a t-shirt like this. I'm going to reach out to you. You're going to be coming on the show as a guest and receive that book, the Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors, signed by George Shire. So get on there today, subscribe, and please enjoy the podcast. Welcome to another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. My guest today was the legendary producer of the AWA's All Star Wrestling and known as Polish Joe. He is also the co-host of the self-proclaimed #1 preeminent podcast, AWA Unleashed, with Chris Tubbs and Mick Karch. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome in Polish Joe Ciupik. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good, Brian. How are you doing? I got to say, before you even get into that, legendary producer just sounds, I will take the compliment, but hey, I was just a video guy doing professional wrestling and at the right place at the right time, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, when you get recognition from legendary commentators like Ron Trongard, Lee Marshall, Larry Nelson, Al DeRusha, that says a lot. And especially because before we came on, I asked you, because you don't look that old. And I was like, how old were you? And you said you were 20 years old when you started there. And I was just in shock because, I never saw who you were until we met at AWA reunion back in October. And I was like, man, he don't look that old to be, but kudos to you for what you've done. So,
well, I appreciate it. I was indeed 20 years old. All of those, so I forgot to turn my alerts off. All of those, kudos from, I will call them legendary announcers. Very humbled, very appreciative of them doing that. Of course, Larry Nelson was the one that gave me the moniker Polish Joe. There's a reason that you didn't see me for a long time on camera, because that was the whole gimmick, I suppose, back in the day, the unplanned gimmick known as Polish Joe.
Yeah, no, it was, I enjoyed it as a kid. It was a great program, especially when you guys went to Vegas. It was, I miss it. And I know a lot of people do. So you've come a long way since then. You still live in Minnesota. Let's talk a little bit about growing up. I know you're from Minnesota. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood, growing up, and how you got started in the wrestling business.
Wow. Well, I grew up in a small town called South St. Paul, Minnesota. I guess first thing it would have been famous for was, at one point it had the world's largest stockyards. And growing up just the hill from those stockyards on any particular warm, humid evening, you were reminded of the infamous stockyards. But no, I mean, I grew up a wrestling fan. My mom and my godmother, who lived right across a city park from where I grew up, they were huge wrestling fans. And I guess by extension, my dad was as well. But it was my mom and my godmother. They're the ones that got me hooked into it, going back to the Saturday night broadcasts of All Star Wrestling with Marty O'Neill, the run, don't walk to get your tickets to that Saturday evening event. Grew up. I remember my first match, my first main event match at the old St. Paul Auditorium. It would have been, oh gosh, probably, I'll say 69, 70. I mean, who the hell remembers, when they're 4 or 5 years old, at least all of the details. But the first main event, and the way I tell the story is, went there and the main event was Mad Dog Vachon versus Crusher in a cage. And I was hooked. Yeah. It just became, a Saturday evening staple, later a Sunday morning staple. And never did I dream of working for the AWA. It wasn't an aspiration, but I did. And that's a whole nother story. But that's I mean, that in a very small nutshell is my growing up as it pertains to professional wrestling. Graduated, in high school, as I sort of move into how I got started in my career. In high school, I did all of the PA announcing for the high school sports. I've been a longtime sports fan and had aspirations to be a play-by-play commentator for either football or baseball. So I went a year to the University of Minnesota, and discovered college just really wasn't for me, and decided to dropped out after the fall of what would have been my sophomore year. I was the equipment manager for the University of Minnesota football team under Lou Holtz. And decided I needed to do something different. I just didn't want to do college. So I went to, I guess you could call it a technical school called the Brown Institute back in the day. It evolved to Brown College. It's no longer around, but Brown Institute is a 9-month course, 3 months of radio, 3 TV, and another 3 of radio. And it was during the TV course, the 3 months of that, the very first day, there was a new student that was just there for the television part of it. And I recognized the last name, and it happened to be Kathy Gagne, one of Vern's four children. And I believe Kathy is second in the pecking order. I think it's Greg, Kathy, Donna, and then Beth. But when I heard the name, I had to ask. Well, being a wrestling fan, and she said, I'm Vern Gagne's daughter. Well, that just opened up the floodgates to a bunch of questions. I guess technically the second question that I asked her was, what was the Crusher's real name? Crusher was my favorite wrestler growing up, and she told me it was Reggie Lazowski, and we just became friends. And once TV was done, went back to radio, I didn't think anything of, the friendship or any connection to Kathy Gagne, let alone the AWA. I didn't think anything of it. the day I graduated, or our class graduated, went down to a little bar a couple of blocks down called the Poodle Club. Might have had a drink or 10 that day. And I get home, and one of my classmates, as Larry Nelson calls him, Whippoorwill Brian, who was a classmate, an Iowa Hawkeye fan. And he called me up and said that Kathy had called him about coming in to run camera for some interviews for the AWA. And Will said, yeah, sure, sounds good. He wasn't really a wrestling fan, but he thought, yeah, it sounds good. And then she asked Will if there was anybody else that he could think of that would be good for it. And Will right away says, well, yeah, what about Joe? And Kathy apparently said, oh, I can't believe I didn't think of him. So went into the AWA offices the following Monday, and both Will and I were given the crash course on how to operate the camera and so forth. And the first interviews that we did, that we recorded, was of gorgeous Jimmy Garvin and Mr. Electricity Steve Regal, along with their manageress Precious. They had just the night before in St. Paul, they had defeated the Road Warriors for the Tag Team Championships. And of course, I always have to add in the caveat of, with the help of the fabulous Freebirds, those dastardly flying Freebirds. And so we did several interviews with Garvin and Regal and Precious for different, we did general interview, a couple of market edit interviews for upcoming matches they had in the towns. That's the way the show was done back then. And we got done with it. And the producer at the time, Mike Shields, who actually came up from Memphis, Jerry Jarrett recommended Mike to Vern when the AWA got the ESPN contract. And Mike asked us into the office and said, hey, would you guys be interested in doing an internship? Well, shit, I'm 20 years old. I'm fresh out of broadcast school. And here I thought I was going to, go to some small town and, with a population of about 30 people, broadcasting as a DJ or something along those lines, or doing play-by-play commentary for some local town team. I thought, by all means, yes, I'd love to take the internship. And so October 7th of 1985, I started my career as a production assistant, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow. That is amazing. That is, what a stroke of luck that you were in a class with Kathy Gagne. And, I've talked to Greg several times. Nice guy. I've never met the sisters in person. I've only met Greg, and they seem like a nice family. And I remember seeing them on TV sometimes doing interviews or whatever, and it was pretty neat.
Do you ever wonder what would happen if
you give a dad a podcast?
I'm what you call a nerdy fan. I nerd out at this stuff hardcore.
You'll hear me talk about anime on here. You'll hear me talk about Power Rangers. You'll hear me talk about wrestling on here.
Okay.
I had an axe handle with a Twisted Tea on it. It was right after that Twisted Tea video went viral. And man, they went out and grabbed it and smacked a dude in the head with it. It was so...
That's great.
I'd like to think of this podcast as a nostalgia moment for me. It's a show where I can talk about whatever I want.
I'm a human and animal chiropractor. There was a picture of me. It looked like I was on the side of a ramen box over in China. But
So I took my kids with me to Comic-Con.
I thought that was really cool.
I don't know if my wife should listen to this podcast. We'll cut that part out.
You hope. Be like, and then Robert said this.
If You Give a Dad a Podcast. Available now on all podcasting platforms.
Let's talk a little bit about you had a lot of interaction, obviously, with those guys once you started in there. Can you give us a story maybe a really interesting one that you had with one of a well-known wrestler?
Oh my, there are there are several of them. I guess let me share a story with that involves Sherry Martel.
Okay.
So my very excuse me, my very first trip to Las Vegas when the AWA shifted from doing the shows in Atlantic City as part of Pro Wrestling USA, and the early AWA Championship Wrestling matches were done. Switched over to the showboat, and here I am, still a 20-year-old kid. Maybe I was 21 at the time, but going to Vegas. Actually, I would have been 20, because I remember, if I'm remembering correctly, you had to be 21 to drink in Vegas at the time. And I wasn't quite there, but I managed to maybe get a cocktail or two playing the machines. But anyway, so the trips to Vegas were always short. We weren't there for fun. It was about 21 hours that we were in Vegas. We'd fly in on a Saturday morning, do the show, and then fly back out Sunday mornings. Well, being a young kid, I decided don't need sleep. I'm going to enjoy Sin City, Las Vegas, Nevada. So I stayed up all night, went back to my room, and unfortunately fell asleep. This was probably about 5:30 in the morning, and the flight was just after 7 in the morning. Now, this was before you needed to be at the airport for 2 hours, of course. I mean, you could show up 20 minutes before and fly right through, do the old O.J. Simpson Hertz commercial, running through the airport thing. Well, about 6:30, I hear a pounding at the door, and it's Larry Nelson. And he took care of me. He said, "Joe," I wasn't even Polish Joe yet. Joe, we gotta, hey, get up. And I'm scrambling. I'm tired. I, still wouldn't say drunk, but I certainly wasn't sober either. And so got onto the airplane finally, and thinking, okay, I can, sleep a little bit on the flight home. Well, mid-flight, I woke up with Sherry Martel. It was about like this. She was right in front of my face, and she had lipstick.
Oh, no.
With lipstick on. And, well, obviously I knew what she was trying to do. She was going to put makeup on me, and I wouldn't know it when I woke up, and I'd be walking through the airport. Well, fortunately, I did wake up. She started laughing, and the boys around her started laughing, trying to initiate the new young kid on the block. And so she got up, and I said, "Sherry, did you get any makeup on me?" "No, Joe, no, I did not." "Well, shall we say I was going to call bullshit until I could prove it myself." And so I decided to try to get up to go to the bathroom to look for myself, get this off as quickly as possible. Well, they did manage to do one thing, and that was to tie both of my shoes to the airplane seat.
Oh.
So, and by the way, in double knots. And so I was finally able to get out, went into the bathroom, and I did indeed see that they did not get it. Came back to my seat. Of course, I mean, what am I going to do? I could only laugh. They got me, but they didn't get me. Yeah, so then just one story with scary / sensational Sherry Martel.
Yeah, that's a good one though. That's pretty funny. You know, you did a lot of shows with them. You had a lot of interaction with, let's say, rockers, Scott Hall, Kurt Hennig, Playboy Buddy Rose, Pretty Boy Doug Summers, Garvin and Regal you talked about. What was your interactions like with those guys? As far as, was there a difference between when you were in production and then when you were off production? Was it different? I mean, was it, I don't know how to say it, like not night and day, but you know, your business when you're in production and you're not in business, what was those kind of interactions like for you?
You know, the thing with professional wrestlers in general, not all of them, of course, but and I want to say this respectfully and appropriately, but they're all really just a bunch of grown-up kids. And so and which is great. So the you know, playing pranks on one another, just having fun in general. But then when it came time for them to do an interview, like on interview day, they became professionals. Well, basically, once the countdown started, that's when they stopped being the young kids or young children and went professional. They would do their interviews, and later when I was directing them, they'd come into the control room and ask, hey, how was that? Any ideas, any suggestions? And then once that professionalism stopped, they went back to being little kids again. It's just the way that it was. And part of what I love about the business, that it never, shouldn't say never, it needed to be business when it was business, but more times it was just a bunch of grown-ups pretending to be children and having a blast.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories, I guess, about Kurt Hennig and what a prankster he was. You have any good stories? Yeah, you got any good ones of him? I mean, I had the honor of meeting his widow, Lenise, Lenise Hennig, back at the AWA reunion with Hank, his youngest son. Really nice people, very down to earth, very approachable. I mean, I probably talked to her for 10 minutes, and her son Hank, just absolutely nice people. But let's you know, Lenise, I know she was probably the held the family together piece. And Kurt, you know, I'm sure he was a good father, and I'm pretty sure of that, but he was a jokester. You got any stories about old cool Kurt?
It's not a question of any stories. It's which one to tell and which ones I can tell. But, I mean, let me start with Lenise. So Lenise and Hank, that's the first time I had met Lenise and Hank was at that reunion.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, she, if I'm not mistaken, Mick Karch had said that was the first time she had made a public appearance as it relates to the AWA and professional wrestling. She just liked to stay in the background. You know, she raised the kids and did a very admirable job. But the one of the stories that I tell about Kurt, and I told Lenise this story, I call it the 14 story.
Okay.
So on one of the trips to Las Vegas, Kurt, I had to stop at I had to run to the AWA offices, which is about a half hour from where I lived, to pick up some 1-inch videotapes, which is what we recorded all of the matches on. And so I just at the office, get everything done, just pull onto the highway. And I look in my rear view mirror and I see this car driving up like a bat out of hell. And so I'm okay, I better stay in the right lane here. And the car pulls up right next to me. And I don't notice right away, but it stays right next to me. So I'm like, okay, what the hell is going on? This car, it's not a cop. It's just a car. And I look over and there's Curt Hennig. And he's motioning me to pull over to the side of the road. Now I'm on a highway. We are on a highway. So I finally pull over. Curt pulls up behind me on the side of the road, on the shoulder of this highway. Curt comes out of his car and he has, he's got a joint in his hand. And I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you pulling me over? So he hands me the joint to take a hit. And it's like, Curt, I got to work. You'll be fine with one. So yes, indeed. I took one toke off of it and I said, Curt, that's fine. I got to get into the car. Let's go. So he goes, today, 14's our lucky number. And I go, why 14? He goes, look at the clock. It's 8:14 in the morning. And our flight is 9:14 in the morning. So he goes, 7's our lucky, or 14's our lucky number. And you get 7 into 14 twice. So just keep that in mind. I go, okay, whatever. Well, and the flight, we get to the airport, the flight number is 777 to go to Las Vegas. It's like, okay, fine, cool. I knew that wasn't like anything out of the ordinary. It was the same flight we took every time to Vegas.
Yeah.
So we get into we go to check in. And both Curt and I are in row 7. He looks at me, goes, pointing above to the numbers. I'm like, yeah, whatever, Curt. We land in Vegas. He goes, hey, you want to split a cab to go to the showboat? Sure. We go to a cab. It's cab 14. Okay. This is sort of getting creepy. We get to the showboat and check in, and we're both on the 7th floor. It's like, okay, whatever. Starting to get a little eerie.
Yeah.
But I continued on. So I'll go and do my thing. I bring the tapes down to the truck. I don't see Curt all afternoon, and do the taping and get all of that wrapped up. I'm in the truck. At that point, I was directing the graphics. So get back after everything's done. Bring the tapes back to the room. Go down into the casino, and I'm sitting at one of the blackjack tables, and right behind us is the roulette wheel. Curt comes and sits at third base, the far left position as you're looking at the blackjack dealer.
Yeah.
Lays down money to play there and turns around to put money down on the roulette wheel. And the dealer says, no, you can't do both. You can only play one or the other. So Curt stood up, made sure that nobody was going to take third base because he was going to play blackjack. Turns around and decides to put $5 down on 14 on the roulette wheel. And I have checked. My memory always escapes me if it was 14 black or 14 red, but it was 14.
Yeah.
Well, guess what hits? 14.
14.
So Curt is just milking it. Just 14 is it, brother. Okay, so comes back to the blackjack table. He goes, you get 2 7s, you get a 14, we're doubling down. It's like, okay, that's insane. The first several times that happens, we both won. I'm like, this is insane. We didn't win every time, but it was the majority of the time we would win. We were hot table, cold dealer, whatever you want to call it. So Curt and I were winning quite a bit of money. He says, "Hey, let's go down on the strip. We gotta take this streak and go down to Caesars." So we do that. Same principle, same everything. Oh, by the way, to go from the Showboat, which was off the strip, go to the strip on Caesars, we had to take a cab. Guess what cab number we took? It was flipping cab number 14. So we get done, and it's probably 5:30 in the morning. Again, another night of not sleeping in Las Vegas. It's like, yeah, we got to wrap this up. We got to head back to the hotel, get our stuff, and get to the airport. Well, I'm up $7,000. Kurt's up $14,000. He's like, hey, and I'm like, Kurt, this is insane, So we get back to the hotel, going to take the cab back to the hotel, and guess what back to the airport. Guess what cab takes us to the airport? It's cab flipping 14 again. Different driver, but it was cab 14. And Kurt just would not live that down. He comes in every day the next, or we usually had him on Tuesdays. He comes in, he makes sure that he is there at 8:14 so that he could be in the control room to just tell me 14. I'm like, Jesus Christ, what the hell? He goes, and I kid you not, but I recall him saying, I'm perfect. A foreshadowing.
Yes, of the Mr. Perfect. Yes. Yeah.
So anyway,
wow. That's a good story.
It's one I told Lenise, and she just smiled, and so did Hank, and I can still see Kurt with that shit-eating grin on his face of he I was at a wrestling show this past weekend, and I can't believe I hadn't thought of it, but the best analogy that I can give to what Curt Hennig was like was Dennis the Menace. He loved to mess with people, but not in a bad way or a mean way, but just as like a practical joker, or as we say in the business of ribber, and he was the king of ribs.
Yeah, I've heard stories, and it was so great to meet Lenise and Hank, like I said earlier. And I met Joe actually in Dallas last year. He said he's starting to get back into it. I don't know what he's up to now, but great family. I've heard a lot of great stories about Kurt, and since you had interaction with him, I was glad to hear. That's a good one though. The Vegas, the 7 and 14. That's great. So let's talk a little bit about working in the AWA. You did a lot of production. Did you have a lot of interaction with Vern or Greg or Al DeRusha, those guys? I know you had interaction with Larry and Rod Trongar and those guys, but what about Vern, Greg, the guys that, the owner and the owner's son? What was that kind of stuff like for you?
Well, I saw them more than I would see the majority of the talent, because Vern and Greg were in the office every day. The old AWA studio was a renovated old church, single level, vaulted ceilings. And when you walked in, there's the lobby, and then you'd go straight ahead, and those would be the offices. But when you walk into the lobby, to the right was the studio. So pretty much on a daily basis, I would see and interact with Vern and Greg, setting up the next week's TV, getting formats approved, working on them on interview days, just everything in general, getting scheduling interviews for talent that wouldn't be there necessarily on interview day, because it was a long, arduous day, anywhere from 6 to 12 hours long. But Vern, you have some of his detractors who say that he, well, basically that he was a prick, but I can't go that far. I will say that Vern was a very shrewd businessman. He was known in the industry for paying well and being one of the best payoffs in the business. What I will say about him is he was just one of those guys that had a charisma about him, the way he carried himself. And when we'd walk into to a restaurant or any place that where there were people, he was recognized. People would come up to him. Vern would eat it up, and he was a pro, absolute pro at interacting with the public. Ate it up and did a fantastic job with it. And he was great. He was phenomenal to work for, even though my time at the AWA sadly was the end of it. But maintained a friendship really with Vern, so much so that I mean Vern and Nick Bockwinkel were both at my wedding.
Oh wow!
On my Polish Joe's AWA Memories Facebook page, I posted the picture. It's myself in the middle in my tux, and I got Vern on one side and Nick on the other side. The wedding photographer took it, and my wife had it blown up to poster size, and then had both Nick and Vern autograph it for me, had it framed, and she gave that to me. That might have even been, I think, for our first anniversary photo.
Wow.
And Nick came over to the house one day, had it hanging up, and he goes, "Joe, you notice something about Vern in the picture?" And I'm like, "No, it's just Vern in the picture." And he goes, "Well, take a look at how I'm standing." And I've got my arms around both of them. And Nick was about 6'2", Vern was maybe 6 foot, so I was taller than them. So, had my arms around their shoulders. Nick is standing there, arms at his side, posing, being Nicholas Bach as he was. Vern, and this is what Nick pointed out, Vern is holding my arm that's around his shoulder. He's holding my wrist. And Nick goes, "You know why Vern's doing that, don't you?" And I go, "No, I don't know." He goes, "Just wanted to make sure you weren't going to get one up on him." He was always on the defensive for that. And so I asked Vern about that. He wouldn't comment. He just, that Vern Gagne smile and that little little giggle was all that he said about it. But got married in '98, and that friendship, keeping that friendship actually got me back into the AWA, starting in December of '99. And this I'll evolve this into to Greg Gagne. I mean, I was on good terms with both Vern and Greg at the end of the AWA. Didn't have much interaction with them in the '90s. My career had taken me to working for an educational multimedia company, doing production for them. And then I started my own business in 1995 and have been self-employed since then. But in December of '99, Greg Gagne had called me up and said that they had gotten a sponsor and they wanted to do 13 half-hour shows on Channel 9, KMSP Channel 9, which is the station that the AWA was on at the end of its run. They had agreed to do 13 half-hour shows, and Greg asked if I would come back and produce, direct, edit, do everything for that, and we did. it got to be, the ratings were fantastic. The response from people was fantastic. And all we did was we used the old footage from the library, matches from the Civic Center, whatever it was, and just highlighted a particular talent. It'd be Andre one week, Crusher the next, Hulk Hogan the next, High Flyers, you name it. But it got the reception was so good that we were able to catch the attention of the Hubbard family, who owned a local station, KSTP, among other media things. The Hubbards are, I think they're in the Forbes 400. I mean, they're very wealthy, but they owned USSB Satellite, and they had just sold it to Direct TV. Well, after the 3 months of doing the shows, so first quarter of 2000, Stan Hubbard Jr. said, well, hey, we got USSB. Let's do a test and do a pay-per-view on USSB. So we did a 2-hour show, the Best of AWA Classic Wrestling Volume 1.
Yeah.
And the numbers did so well, it was so popular, that we ended up doing not only a total of 24 AWA pay-per-views, but we ended up doing, I think it was another 17 pay-per-views using other libraries. We did one for Glow. A gentleman by the name of Mark Nolte had access to Florida Championship Wrestling, Memphis, Southwest Championship Wrestling. And so we did a whole, and then later on, Mike Graham and Dusty Rhodes, we did 3 shows with them to broadcast Florida Championship Wrestling matches, which the Graham family owned. And so we did that for about 3 years until what became the eventual sale of the AWA. We finalized the sale in March of 2003 to the WWE.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a new podcast out called Fouls Count Anywhere. It is a classic pro wrestling podcast that brings you the legends of wrestling with true wrestling fans Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. They bring on guests that are legends in this business, and as well as wrestlers of today, promoters, referees, you name it. They have them on there, folks, and I encourage you to listen to them. If you're on YouTube, watch them. They drop every Saturday. They have their podcast. They drop it in the afternoon. So look forward to that podcast coming out. Falls Count Anywhere podcast with Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. Folks, you will not be disappointed. I guarantee it. And enjoy the podcast. Yeah. I'm kind of iffy on that. I mean, they don't show, to me anyways, they don't show all the really good stuff in that library on when they had the network and now on Peacock even. Some of it's good, like Wrestle Rock, Super Clash 2, 1, 3, and 4, or, but Super Sunday, but they don't have those classic matches from the 60s and 70s on there. And they got like 2 shows from the 87 and 5 shows from 88, and that's about it. And it's kind of frustrating to me because there's I think they're doing that on purpose. That's my personal opinion, because they have such great content, which you were a part of, and I don't think they want to show it because I think it was better than what they had in their era of the 70s and up to before Vince Jr. took it over. That's my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are on it.
I don't have any insight to share as to why they don't show more of it. I have heard this exact statement from many different people saying the same thing. I wish that they would show more of the old matches. Hell, even just showing a pulled up version or version without commercials of the old All Star Wrestling. As a producer, I've never owned a network, but as a producer, the only thing I can think of is that they've got so much content. I mean, think of all of the libraries that they have bought over the years. And then they've got their own stuff. You know, the WWF stuff when Vince McMahon Sr. owned it. And I don't know that there's a lot of that on their network. You know,
there isn't. No.
Yeah. You know, and so I don't think it's any slight towards the AWA or any particular territory. I think it's just there's only so much that we can broadcast. I mean, hell, I think they should do just their own YouTube channel and just play for each territory. Just do the pulled up version of each of the of the old TV shows, and play them as sequentially as you can. And I say that because, at least for the AWA, all of the stuff from the 60s and leading into the 70s was live. And not many, or at least certainly not Vern and Wally and Al at the time, Al Darush at the time, who was the producer of the AWA from the beginning until he left in, I think, 84 to the WWF for a short bit. But it really, they didn't think about recording those onto videotape, because videotape was extremely expensive back then. The big old 1-inch reels and a 60-minute tape weighed about 7 pounds. And I may be off on this, but I want to say it was like $70 or more for a single reel. And that was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
And so what the AWA would do is, if they recorded something, once they got done using what they wanted to off of it, they just record over it. And it wasn't until really starting in the fall of 1980 that Al Darusha started, told Vern, you gotta keep this stuff. You gotta record this and keep this for the future. By that time, and certainly even before then, reruns were big, and thinking outside of the box of the weekly All Star Wrestling show only, you had to start thinking about it. And so starting in about the fall of 80, and I remember this because I can still remember seeing Hulk Hogan's very first interview in the AWA, Minneapolis Auditorium, I believe it was. And the interview, there's this big monster Hulk Hogan. He didn't talk because, quite honestly, and I think he would admit to this, and he was still green on interviews. I mean, he wasn't what we know of the legend, the deserved title of legend for Hulk Hogan. So what they did back in those days, and I still think they do nowadays to a lesser degree, you couldn't talk, well, we're going to put you with the manager. So you had luscious Johnny Valiant hyping up Hulk Hogan, and that was in August of 1980. And thankfully, same time period that Al and I'll say Vern and Greg too decided they got to start keeping all of these old shows, and thankfully they did, and had a nice payday with the sale to the WWF or WWE.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's I didn't know that. See, I didn't know they recorded over their old shows, so that's too bad, because I know they would have had a.
I mean, even when I was working there, just due to Vern not wanting to have that budget item, to have that expense, interviews. I had mentioned earlier, every week we would do interviews, typically on a Tuesday, sometimes on a Wednesday. where all of the talent would come in and we would do the market edit interviews. We had the general All Star Wrestling show, 1 hour show. Interviews were anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 minutes long, depending on the talent and whether or not they could carry an interview for 2.5 minutes. And a lot of those interview reels, once they were done, we'd save them for a couple of weeks. If there's anything really special about them, we'd spin them off to either a 3/4 inch or another working 1-inch tape, and then we'd record over them. Sadly, a lot of those outtakes we don't have. Sadly, at that point, watching the pennies resulted in lost dollars years later.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Let me ask you this. After the AWA, did you do any other type of wrestling programming for any other promotion?
None of the major ones. It's all been for indie leagues here in Minnesota. I even had my own wrestling league for a short time. The first company that contacted me, I did their shows for a while, and then the promoter decided he wanted to get out of it. So I said, you know what, you still got the TV contract. I'm going to take it over, start my own league, which was called the American Wrestling League, or AWL. Did that for about a year, and didn't make any money on it, despite I didn't lose money. But once the TV contract, it wasn't renewed, I want to say in the summer of 2005. When that wasn't renewed, I'm like, I'm a TV guy who just happens to do a lot of wrestling, and without a TV contract, I don't have any interest in doing it. So since then, I've worked with 1, 2, 3, 4 other independent wrestling organizations. In fact, I was just at a show this past Saturday for Midwest All Star Wrestling, or MAW. At a show at the Turtle Lake Casino, St. Croix Turtle Lake Casino in Wisconsin. So they hired me to come and direct the show, and finished with a cage match. That was fun because it's the first cage match I had directed since December of 1987. The Rockers against Rose and Summers. And so
that was a good one.
Yes. And so, it was fun. So I joke that professional wrestling just won't leave me alone. It keeps following me. The truth is, I don't really want it to avoid me. But it does, it does keep finding me. In fact, I mean, even today, to get back to Greg Gagne, Greg is involved with PowetTown Wrestling.
Yes.
And PowetTown is headed up by a gentleman named Steve Rosenthal, who is credited with starting the genre of professional wrestling action figures with the old Remco dolls.
Correct.
So anyway, they contacted me, and so I'm working with them right now to get their product line rolled out and launched. The first figures apparently will be finally released this spring.
Yes.
I got to tell you, they look, that especially the Brody. The Brody action, it's like, holy shit, that looks like Frank Goodish. The same guy who I gave a ride back to the hotel room, back to his hotel after Wrestle Rock, and scared the shit out of me until I got to know him.
I ordered those figures back in, I don't know, October, I think it was. And I'm so excited to get them. I ordered the whole series 1 set.
Yeah.
And
thank you for that. I will have to add, part of the reason for the delay, they were going to be released. They would have been released by now, but they did when they got the first run back. When they went to articulate the legs, it wouldn't go up far enough, and it actually broke. And so rather than rather than release a product that we weren't 100% satisfied with, we went back into production, got them reconfigured, reconstructed, and that's now solved, and production now has commenced on those final figures to be released. So I'm looking forward to those. And I was able to interview Stan Hansen for it, Carrie Von Erich's daughter, Barb Goodish, Bruiser Brody's wife, Greg Gagne, Magnum TA, and it's just fun. Learn several things, like with Stan Hansen, when Stan would get introduced, and he would always do the hook 'em horns and then would yell, "You!" Well, I asked him, what were you yelling when you would do that? And he's chuckled and he goes, well, when I first started in the business, it was a shot to the old guys. And what he was yelling was youth. Youth. Well, he chuckled because now he's one of the old guys in the industry. And then Barb Goodish, I asked her, when Brody would come out, punch. Well, I go, how and why did that start?
Yeah.
Well, she tells the story that in one of his early matches, he came out and he was clearing his throat as he was walking out, and he liked the way that it sounded, and so he decided to just go like he's clearing his throat. So
there you go.
It's just it's a pleasure to and an honor to talk with whether the talent that is still alive or their families, just to get that retrospective of these legends of professional wrestling.
Yeah, I had the honor of, I've interviewed Barbara Goodish probably about a year ago now on here, and just a sweet lady. I had the opportunity to meet her at the CAC reunion in Vegas last fall, and this May they're having the Bruiser Brody Memorial up in St. Louis, and I'm going to that. Greg will be there, Gagne, and a bunch of Stan Hansen. So hopefully those figures will be out, because I would love to get my Stan Hansen one autographed by Stan Hansen. So I'm looking forward to that. One last question, Polish Joe.
Yep. You're
on the #1 self-proclaimed preeminent podcast, AWA Unleashed. How did you get involved with that, and how's it going with that podcast with you?
So Mick Karch, who is one of the other co-hosts along with Chris Tubbs, but Nick worked for a very brief time with the AWA back in 1987, and Mick and I can't even tell you the number of shows, mainly indie shows over the years, that we have worked together. I've hired him to do play-by-play commentary when I had my own league, as I mentioned earlier, and we just had a friendship. And then last, I'd seen that they had done the AWA Unleashed. They had another co-host, George Shire, was part of it in the beginning, and that didn't work out for George, or in general for the podcast. And so I ran into both Mick and Chris at a wrestling show that I was directing last November. And we just got to talking. Oh, by the way, they did have me on as a guest prior.
Right.
And I just talking with Chris, and she said, hey, I'd love to have you be a co-host. They were down to 2, and they felt that they wanted a third. They thought that I'd be a good fit, and lo and behold, now for about 2-3 months, I've been doing the AWA Unleashed podcast, and I don't find it to be work. And much like this podcast, it's not work. Work to me is you have to, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but you got to work towards or put forth a strong effort to be, dare I say, good at it. Well, for me, it's easy because I lived it. So it's just talking about my experiences, talking about myself, whether it's as a fan growing up watching All Star Wrestling or working in the business, since 1985 off and on. So it's real easy. I really enjoy it. I mean, for your listeners, if you haven't subscribed to it already, go to YouTube, AWA Unleashed, and if you don't get a fill of my voice right now and a glutton for more punishment, then subscribe to AWA Unleashed and enjoy some old AWA wrestling stories.
It is a great podcast. I've listened to it. I know Mick. I know Chris. I've interacted with you, and you're a really nice. It's a great show. It really does talk about the AWA and that era when, to me and to those that listen, what wrestling was wrestling. It was great, and it is a great podcast. And your addition to it, because I've watched it since you've been on there as well, and it is. You guys have a good chemistry together. It feels like, it seems like, and you mesh well. And it's good. So I will have all that information down in the description for the AWA Unleashed.
Thank you.
And one more time, folks, Polish Joe Ciupik, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
It's easy and it's just fun to talk about the old AWA. Usually I'm sitting at some bar and somebody finds out I produced the AWA, and what turns into one question ends up to, as the Crusher would say, 2-3 beers and or more, and a long storytelling. Again, it's easy. I love to do it. I have nothing but fond memories of my time with the AWA, and still to this day in professional wrestling. It's a very unique industry, and I just love it. Just love it.
Yeah, I do as well, and I enjoy doing these podcasts. And I want to thank you one more time for coming on, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, Polish Joe, thank you again, sir, for coming on. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. If you're listening, thank you. If you're watching, thank you, and we will talk to you soon.